Good morning. Very happy to have two great friends up here today and former colleagues on the CUFI stage on a very important topic. First, I'll introduce them. Anthony Ruggiero is Senior Vice President at American Global Strategies. He served for 20 years in the US government, most recently as in the first Trump administration as Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. He has extensive experience at the US Treasury Department, working on sanctions, at the State Department as well, and in then Senator Marco Rubio's office as a Foreign Policy Fellow. And he's currently an Adjunct Senior Fellow at FTD as well. Behnam, round of applause. Behnam Ben Taleblu is Senior Director of FTD's Iran program. He oversees FTD's extensive work on all facets of the Islamic Republic. He also is a Senior Fellow working on Iran's security and political issues, and a native Persian speaker. And I would also add probably one of the humblest people I know in DC in the think tank space. So very lucky to have both of them there. When we first envisioned here, and when we first envisioned this panel a month or two ago, we were clearly in a different space in Iran. We were going to be talking about an Iran deal, what that looks like. Clearly this month, the 12-day war has kind of put an emphatic end to that discussion for the time being. We know the president and the Israelis both took very decisive action, but there's a lot of questions that we have yet to have answers for, so we'll dive right in. So I'll start with you, Behnam. What is your assessment of how successful the US and Israeli strikes were, the wide range of military and nuclear-related targets, and how much has this really shaken the regime?
Well, thanks very much, Boris. Great to be here. Thank you all for turning out today. It's a real pleasure to be in your midst and to share the panel with really good friends and colleagues. Listen, I'll try to keep it brief. There's a difference between the Israeli strike and the American strike. The American strike was a counter-proliferation operation. It was a limited strike against 3 facilities using some of America's heaviest, if not the heaviest, bunker buster bomb, the massive ordnance penetrator. These strikes were designed to cripple facilities. You may hear a conversation now in the press and with the media and some former intel people talking about the fissile material. That necessarily was not the target of the mission. The target of the mission was to collapse these facilities. And I don't think any of these facilities really withstood the weight of that 30,000-pound bunker buster bomb. So the goal was to collapse the facilities, and Uncle Sam collapsed the facility. It doesn't mean that the Iranians are totally done, but it means that ultimately, after 5 presidents talking about, the Islamic Republic of Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, only one of them pulled the trigger, and the hope is that the regime understands that he'll pull it again if they continue to act this way. The second is just with the Israelis. I'll be very brief on this. You can call the Israeli mission something between counter-proliferation and counter-regime. They tried to basically defang the missile and military threat that the regime poses. First, they worked on a whole host of bases, then a whole host of military facilities. As you know, this strike began with an intelligence surprise going after nuclear scientists as well as the commanding heights of the Islamic Republic's military apparatus. They had a lot of success basically by not just going after the arrow, but by going after the archer. So the Israelis struck not just Iranian missiles and drones, but the platforms from which they launched. So you could have 1 million missiles. If you don't have a single platform, you can't launch it. And that's why I call it a defanging mission.
Thank you, Behnam. Anthony, so barring some kind of wide-ranging deal happening in the short and medium term, financial sanctions are going to be so important. Can you talk to us about kind of how the Iranians are able to fund their programs, what are their really big sources of income, and what you would recommend if you were at the Treasury Department or at the White House as far as ways to not only enforce current sanctions, but to beef them up to make sure that Iran doesn't have the funds to rebuild their nuclear and military programs?
Sure. Well, thanks. Also, great to be here. Great to be with you as well, and Boris. We talk a lot, and yeah, financial sanctions can be the backbone of addressing the Iranian regime. I think the challenge here, though, is that the Iranians spend a lot of time, working, keeping the Europeans from with the snapback sanctions in the UN and getting countries to buy their oil and some of the other commodities they have. I just don't see that happening in the future now. The Iranians are in a tough position where they really will either have to accept a deal. I don't know if we'll talk about that later. It's accept the deal that the President Trump has on the table, or they really can't go back to, I don't think, selling on the open market, or they're likely going to get UN sanctions put back on them before October. So, I think the Iranians are in a tough position based on the strikes that Behnam talked about, and I think that sanctions may be one of the things they do, but it's more likely there'll be some kind of deal in the future.
And Anthony, you've worked for a lot of years in the non-proliferation space. How do you see the IAEA, the International Nuclear Watchdog, role in all this? Has their performance been kind of what you would expect, and what should we be looking for from them in terms of their ability to assess nuclear Iranian facilities and assets going forward?
Yeah, it's one of the things that we worked on when I was in the National Security Council in the first Trump administration, which I think no one really gives President Trump credit for, is that Grossi was elected during his term, his first term, and there were people running against Grossi that were, essentially supporters of Iran or the sort of different approach to Iran. And I think Grossi has played this exactly right. During the 4 years of Biden, he clearly did not have the support of the major donors to the IAEA and the major countries like the US and others to be tougher on Iran. And as soon as President Trump was elected, we started to see some of these more aggressive reports that, told the truth about what Iran was doing, about what they were hiding. I think a lot of the supporters of the JCPOA, the 2015 deal, like to, before the strikes, would sort of dismiss all these things as historical, but which is true that they were doing these things in the past, but their obstruction of the IAEA was occurring currently. It was happening now. And so when they talk about the IAEA was doing things that were, outside the scope, they were completely inside the scope. They might get on the ground. It's unclear if they will actually get on the ground. I know, the Parliament and others have talked about stopping cooperation with the IAEA. That's probably likely. And then we'll be reliant, I think, on intelligence to figure out what's going on in the ground.
Thank you. Behnam, you talked a little bit about archers and arrows. How do you assess the conventional forces? They took such a hard hit, the Air Force, launchers, other military sites, the Ministry of Intelligence. How do you see the Iranians retooling after this? Obviously, a lot of their Russian-bought systems did not perform very well. So where do you see kind of the conventional forces going here now to try to rebuild what they've lost?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, because the job is not yet done, because this is an adversary that every time it's put to the choice of guns to fight Israel, to fight America, to fight its neighbors, or butter to provide for its own people, it's consistently chosen guns over butter. And that means that this is a game that we have to win over a protracted period of time. This has never been a one-shot deal. That's why it's been a problem for many U.S. presidents. And I think moving forward, the art of the deal now, before you get to any kind of deal or another potential strike or what have you, is to how do you prevent the Iranian effort of building back better, for lack of a better word? How do you prevent them from rearming? How do you prevent them from retooling? How do you prevent them from building on the lessons learned from this current iteration of conflict with Israel? This is not their first iteration of conflict. If you believe what they say when they say death to America, when they say death to Israel, they mean it, so it probably won't be their last one either. I think the regime is basically wounded. It is down. But just like its proxies, it is down, but it is not out. And when it is down, it is still lethal. It could still do damage with the weapons that it has. Obviously, the regime knew it could not win a conventional war against Israel, against America, but they're trying to turn time into a weapon on their side. They still have, even post-strike, the largest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East, the largest drone arsenal in the Middle East, and they may use it if they believe that, there'll be another round of strikes, or if they believe the regime is in jeopardy. So we're not out of the woodwork yet, but we've shown this regime that, again, someone was willing to pull the trigger, and that there will be mounting costs for them if they continue to go in this direction. So Anthony talked about sanctions. The best way you can prevent them from building back better is to cripple the money that is used to help them build back better, to impede that revenue, to go after the oil trade with China, China, and do this by going after ports, by going after banks, by going after businesses, by going after ships and shippers and insurers. There's a whole way to nest this problem into the larger China challenge that we all face.
And Behnam, you touched on something you and I have talked a lot about, the Iranian-Russian relationship, and adding China into that as well. Russia and China were noticeably very quiet during the Israeli engagement, and even more so after the U.S. took action. What do you make of that?
I'll just say that my friend and former colleague Boris taught me this phrase. I think it was a Russian phrase, which is, there is no honor among thieves. Okay, this is what distinguishes the American alliance system in the world and the anti-American alliance system in the world. No doubt what unites them, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and Anthony can talk about this as well, is a revisionist military posture, is a shared anti-Americanism, is a love for authoritarianism and not democracy. But these guys also, they're not going to rush to help each other. They'll rush to, make them more dependent on one another. They'll make it more costly for America to contest these guys. But when Russia is bogged down in Ukraine, when China is juggling a trade war and a whole host of other things, they're not going to divert national resources to go deal with a country that they believe is a pawn in their larger strategic competition against America. So this actually has the potential to really send a deterrent cascade to Russia and China in a way that, for example, our Afghanistan withdrawal did not.
Awesome. That was a great answer. Anthony, we talked this a little bit backstage, but each day we kind of get conflicting messages about the status of Iran's nuclear materials. And what concerns you the most about what hasn't been hit, accounted for, or what the Iranians are going to maybe reclaim from some of these sites that have been hit?
Yeah, it is. It can be concerning. I mean, there's three things: facilities, nuclear scientists, and the material itself. And so the facilities were hit, but as many of us know, the IAEA monitoring was reduced by Iran since February 2021. So do they have the materials to build a new facility somewhere else? They certainly claimed that they were going to do that before the strikes. Israel spent a lot of time going after nuclear scientists. Now, maybe their junior scientists are just not capable, or maybe they are capable, and they will rise to that level. And then the third thing is, where is the enriched uranium? Is it entombed in one of the sites somewhere that was already struck, or was it moved beforehand? And I think those are the biggest questions that are there. I think the Iranians certainly were at the threshold, and perhaps if they have the material and can build a site, that they would sprint toward. That's why I think there's this tendency with all these strikes to, sort of pat ourselves on the back and be like, okay, we took care of that, let's move to the next thing. This is still an ongoing issue of, do the Iranians have a pathway to a nuclear weapon? And I agree that, when you look at America, just on the alliance question, Russia and China, and, depending on what media sources you get, talk a lot about that President Trump doesn't like alliances, right? But it was the U.S. standing with Israel, standing with others, working with the Europeans on this issue, whereas Iran looked around and there was no one around. There was no China, there was no Russia. And so that narrative was basically debunked in this process.
Do unto others.
Behnam, talk to us about the Iranian domestic situation. Obviously, in the past couple of decades, there have been some very vocal opposition movements, decentralized, however. And the younger generation, we've heard from all the statistics and kind of all the polling you can get in Iran, is very pro-Western, doesn't like the regime. How do you see the future of Iran's opposition, and what can those on the outside do to be supportive of their aspirations?
This deserves a panel in and of itself, but I'll tell you, as a first-generation Iranian American, there is a massive chasm between the state in Iran, which is anti-American and anti-Israel, and the street in Iran, which is pro-American and pro-Israel. And to be honest with you, you don't really have that across much of the rest of the Muslim Middle East. And so in terms of a I don't want to say commodity, but in terms of a strategic and moral asset, that is something that America and Israel and pro-America and pro-Israel audiences cannot afford to ignore. I'll be the first to critique many of America's regime change wars in the Middle East, particularly given the cost and particularly given the failures. But Iran is ironically the place where you can actually marry your head and your heart when it comes to strategy and values in the Middle East. So I think standing with this population, the next time they make sure they go out into the streets, it's not obviously going to be in the middle of a war, but there will be more discontent. You know, things will dawn on the next generation of brave Iranians again. And the next time they go out, we need to make sure that the playing field is a bit more leveled between the state and the street. You know, some of you know some countries have done cyber attacks on gas stations. Maybe those cyber attacks actually end up following the next time there is, for example, a protest. Or, you know, the regime this time cut out internet so that Iranians couldn't communicate with one another and they couldn't actually organize during this time. Maybe that there's a way to get Starlink into Iran, or to maybe get more funding for VPNs. But, you know, rule number one is do no harm. And that means do not give sanctions relief to the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, who is still trying to get the world's most dangerous weapons. That's the way you even the playing field between the state and the street. Do no harm. Do not put money and time back on the Ayatollah's side.
I think everybody here agrees with that completely. A couple more questions to go, and then we'll wrap up. Anthony, you've been in the room with the president and other senior national security leaders. We have a lot of college and high school students in the crowd who have aspirations to be in the national security space, like both of you. Tell us about the work that something like this takes to pull off, and what is it like when a big decision like this is made in the White House?
Sure, that's a great question. You know, I say to high school and college students all the time, you know, sometimes you have a dream job and you get that out of college or graduate school, and I had a dream job, but I didn't get it, but I got a job that I learned a lot, and then through, I guess, skill and luck, wound up at the White House. And every single day going into the White House and working on these issues was a privilege that I'm still shocked that I was able to do it for 2.5 years. And, you know, there's a lot of staff work that goes on these issues, you know, work behind the scenes. You know, the movies and the TV shows focus on the meeting with the president or the principals, but there's all these other meetings and work and late nights and missing your family and all of those, but it's worth it. And, you know, I think the president makes those decisions. Right now, he's gone a different direction with the National Security Council, but that's, you know, as I remind people, it's the president's council. He gets to do what he wants, and he gets to make the decisions either in the Oval Office or in the JFK Situation Room. But it's a humbling experience, and so if you ever get a chance to be in that job, whatever level it is, and I would encourage that and take advantage of that. Take advantage of everything that is offered to you in that space.
Thank you, and thank you for your service. So, closing question. Our folks are going to be going to the Hill tomorrow to talk with their representatives about Iran, amongst other issues. As you mentioned, there's been a lot of excitement about these strikes and what they mean. But what would you recommend that they convey, and this is for both of you, what would you recommend that they convey to our policymakers about how seriously they still need to take the threat of Iran under this regime? So please, any closing thoughts from both of you?
Yeah, I mean, I would start with what's the next step? Is it going to be the current Iranian regime? And if that's the case, then, you know, we still have all these outstanding questions on the nuclear program, where we are on sanctions, and encouraging the administration to push for UN sanctions, US sanctions. I know Behnam talked a lot about the specifics of that. Or is this, you know, a support to the Iranian people for them to make the decision about the type of government they really want to have, whether that's democracy or not? I know we have a long history of that here in the U.S., but, you know, they currently, in my view, don't get to make that decision, and perhaps they should, or they definitely should. And so encouraging that. But I think the number one thing is that this is not solved or done. There's more to be done. The strikes went a long way in this issue and other issues in terms of reinforcing the military option, but it's not a solved issue. And so hopefully when you go on the Hill that there's an understanding of that.
Behnam?
Yeah, just a footnote to those three very good ideas. Just one, making sure, this might sound boring, but making sure that the administration in Washington and Congress has the back of the IAEA, because the best battle damage assessment post-strike will come from the IAEA. So making sure there's political support for the IAEA to actually be able to carry out its mission and go inspect these sites and facilities and get us the real status of the uranium, if it's missing, if it's entombed, if it's whatever. So that's one. The second is the Maximum Pressure Act and the President's maximum pressure policy, which is already being carried out under the auspices of National Security Presidential Memorandum Number 2. You basically want to fully support the oil sanctions, the energy sanctions that President Trump resurrected, and make sure that they stay in force and they escalate over time. So if the regime is boxing with you, this is one way you can make sure one arm is tied behind their back. And the third thing, which is, again, to the heart of the matter, is we will face this problem so long as we face an Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran is not the problem. It's the Islamic Republic of Iran that's the problem. There is a bill in Congress called the Maximum Support Act. This puts meat on the bone when it comes to standing with the Iranian people in practice, when it comes to being able to provide internet technology, to have a strategy of circumvention, and to actually maybe get the good guys empowered in the Middle East for one time. So I would say support the IAEA, support max pressure, support the Maximum Support Act.
Thank you to you both. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. And thank you to you all.